Do not touch her. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, low and absolute, the kind of sound that did not ask for silence but simply created it. Every conversation in the great courtyard died. Every head turned. And Seren Ashval, who had spent the better part of her 24 years perfecting the art of being overlooked, found herself standing at the center of the most dangerous kind of attention. She had not moved. She had not spoken. She had simply been walking, as she always walked, close to the walls and away from the torchlight, her basket of dried herbs pressed against her chest like a shield, her eyes on the worn stones beneath her feet. She had learned long ago that invisibility was a skill, and she had honed it the way other women honed beauty or wit, because it was the only currency available to her. But something had changed in the last 3 seconds. Something had changed in a way she did not yet understand, and the gasps she heard rippling outward from her. Position told her that whatever it was not small. She looked up. The Servo Branco stood less than 4 feet away from her. Its coat was not white the way snow is white, cold and absent of color. It was white the way moonlight is white, luminous from within, as if the creature carried its own source of light beneath its skin. Its antlers rose in perfect symmetry, branching 7 times on each side, and from the base of each branch hung something that looked like frost, but moved like breath. It was enormous. It stood as tall at the shoulder as a war horse, and its eyes, when they found hers, were the deep amber of autumn honey, ancient and patient, and entirely without fear. It had walked out of the sacred forest at the northern edge of the palace grounds, which should have been impossible, because the gates had been sealed for 3 days in preparation for the festival. It had walked through the crowd of 500 gathered nobles, warriors, and attendants, as if they were made of mist. And now it stood before Seren, and it lowered its great head, and it knelt. She did not breathe. No one breathed. The silence lasted for 10 full seconds, which is a very long time when you are the person a legend has chosen to kneel before, and then a voice she recognized as belonging to Lord Caston, the head of the royal council, broke the stillness with 3 words that landed like stones in still water. The Portadora has come. Seren took a step backward. Her heel caught on the uneven cobblestone, and she would have fallen if the wall had not been there to catch her. And in the stumbling, she dropped her basket, and the dried lavender and yarrow and silver fern scattered across the ground in a small, ridiculous cloud of fragrance. She watched the herbs fall. She watched the servo watch her. She thought, with the detached clarity that sometimes comes in moments of extreme shock, that her mother had told her this would happen, that her mother had described this exact scene on a night when the fever had been high, and her eyes had been too bright, and Seren had held her hand and whispered that everything was going to be fine, that she was safe, that the stories were just stories. Her mother had said, "When the White One comes for you, do not run." And Seren had squeezed her hand and said she understood, because it was easier than arguing with a dying woman about the difference between prophecy and fever dream. She had not understood. She had not believed. And now, she stood in the courtyard of Vorn Palace, surrounded by 500 witnesses, with a sacred creature that had not been seen in a century bowing at her feet. And she thought with desperate clarity that she was going to need more yarrow, because she was absolutely certain someone was about to make her life significantly more complicated. Step away from it. This voice was different. It came from her left, and it came with authority so complete that her body responded before her mind did, turning toward the sound, the way a compass needle turns north. She had heard this voice before, always at a distance, always directed at someone more important than herself. King Aldrich Vorn stood at the top of the stone steps that led from the palace's main hall into the courtyard, and he was exactly what the stories said he was, and somehow also entirely different from them. He was tall, broad through the shoulder in the way of men who had earned their bodies, rather than inherited them, with dark hair cut close at the sides and left longer on top, pushed back from a face that was all sharp angles and controlled precision. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of a sky that has decided on a storm, but not yet committed to it. He wore no crown for the festival, only the dark ceremonial coat of the Vorn line with its silver wolf head buttons. And he stood with the easy stillness of someone who had never once in his life needed to make himself appear larger than he was. He was looking at the Cervo Branco, and then he was looking at Seren. And the expression on his face was not wonder, and it was not reverence, and it was not the carefully performed awe she saw on the faces of the nobles around her. It was something sharper than all of those. It was the expression of a man who has just encountered a problem he did not anticipate, and who is already 3 steps into calculating its solution. "Your Majesty," Lord Caston said, his voice barely above a whisper, "the Cervo has chosen. The old law is clear. We cannot simply—" "I am aware of what the old law says," the king said, and descended the steps. The crowd parted for him without being asked, which was not courtesy so much as the instinctive response of bodies that understood proximity to power. He crossed the courtyard at a measured pace, his eyes moving between Seren and the sacred creature with an analytical precision that made her feel like a problem being evaluated. He stopped 6 feet away. The Cervo raised its great head and looked at him, and something moved through its amber eyes that Seren could not name. Something that looked like recognition of a different kind. "What is your name?" the king asked. It took her a moment to understand he was speaking to her. No one of his rank had ever spoken to her directly. "Seren," she said, and then remembered herself. "Seren Ashvale, your Majesty. I am the palace healer's apprentice. I work in the lower herb rooms. I am sorry. I do not know why it came to me. I was only walking. I was not trying to—" "I did not ask for an explanation," he said. His voice was not unkind. It was simply efficient, the voice of a man who considered words a resource to be conserved. "I asked for your name." He looked at the Cervo again for a long moment, his jaw tight, some interior calculation visibly in progress behind those storm-gray eyes. Then he looked at her once more, and this time there was something different in it, something that was not quite professional and not quite personal, but existed in the uncomfortable space between. "Come inside," he said. "Both of you, if it will follow." He turned and walked back toward the steps, without waiting to see if she would obey. She looked at the Cervo. The Cervo looked at her with its ancient amber eyes, and stood, graceful and unhurried, and turned its great body toward the palace doors. She picked up her basket. She gathered what herbs she could from the cobblestones, and she followed because there did not seem to be anything else to do, and because her mother had told her not to run, and because somewhere beneath the shock and the terror and the very reasonable certainty that her life had just changed in ways she could not yet measure, there was something else, something small and bright and frightening, something that felt impossibly like recognition. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this. 1. The council chamber smelled of beeswax and old stone, and the particular mustiness of documents that had been accumulating authority for several centuries. Seren sat in a chair that was not meant for people of her station, which she knew because the cushion was embroidered with the Vorn wolf crest, and because Lord Caston had made a small pained noise when the king gestured for her to sit in it. The Cervo had followed them through the palace corridors without incident, though 3 different guards had attempted to intercept it, and all 3 had stepped aside when the creature simply looked at them with its amber eyes, and continued walking. It stood now at the far end of the chamber, still and luminous, watching everything with the patient attention of something that exists outside of ordinary time. "The Ashvale name," Lord Caston said, spreading a document across the great table with the practiced efficiency of a man who kept his most important papers sorted for exactly this kind of emergency. You are certain of your family line? Your mother's name? Your grandmother's name? My mother was Lisa Ashvale, Saren said carefully. She came from the village of Marin's Cross, in the eastern province. Her mother was Calla Ashvale, formerly Callavael. She stopped. The silence that followed was the particular silence of people who have just heard something they expected to hear, but hoped they would not. Is that significant? Lord Caston set down his pen. He looked at the king. The king was standing at the window, his back to the room, looking out at the courtyard where the festival was presumably still attempting to proceed, without its most dramatic participant. He said nothing. He had said very little since bringing her inside, which Saren was beginning to understand was not unusual for him. The silence around King Aldrich Vorn was not empty. It was full of things he had decided not to say, and learning to read what lived in those silences was, she suspected, a skill that the people around him spent years developing. The Vielle bloodline, Lord Caston said finally, was believed to have ended 80 years ago with the death of Marin Vielle, the last recorded Portadora. It was a founding line, one of the 5 families whose blood is written into the original compact of this kingdom. The Cervo Branco serves as their instrument of recognition. In the old tradition, it appears only when a Portadora comes of age, or when the kingdom faces a crisis that requires the founding power to be awakened. He paused. We are currently facing such a crisis. Saren turned this information over carefully, the way she turned unfamiliar herbs over in her hands before using them, looking for the thorns. What kind of crisis? The king turned from the window. She had not been looking at him while Lord Caston spoke, and so the directness of his gaze when she found it came as a small physical shock, like stepping into cold water. The kind that is not discussed with palace apprentices, he said. His tone was not cruel. It was simply honest in the blunt, uncushioned way of someone who had stopped bothering with diplomatic softening a long time ago. What I will discuss with you is what the old law requires. The Servo's recognition is a public event. It cannot be undone or reinterpreted. As of 1 hour ago, you are formally acknowledged as a Portadora of founding blood, which carries with it certain protections, certain obligations, and certain complications. Complications, she repeated. You will need to be housed in the upper palace, Lord Caston said, in the tone of a man reading from a list he finds personally objectionable. You will need to be educated in the protocols of your station. You will need to be presented formally to the court within 3 days, which is the requirement of the compact. He hesitated. And there is the matter of Lady Mireille. The king's expression did not change, but something in the quality of the stillness around him shifted. That is enough for tonight, he said. Your Majesty, the council will expect. I said that is enough. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Lord Caston gathered his documents with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned precisely where the king's lines were and how much it cost to cross them, and excused himself with a bow that managed to be both respectful and subtly reproachful. The door closed. The chamber contracted into its new size, which was the size of 1 king and 1 apprentice healer and 1 luminous sacred creature. And the silence was a different thing now, more textured, less official. Saren looked at the servo. The servo looked back at her with its patient amber gaze. She said, quietly, I did not ask for this. No one does, the king said. He had moved to the table and was looking at the documents Lord Caston had left, his hands flat on the surface, his attention nominally on the parchment, and actually, she suspected, somewhere else entirely. That is generally how these things work. The old powers are not known for asking permission. He glanced at her. Can you read? The question was so unexpectedly practical that it caught her off guard. Yes. I was taught by the head healer. I can read in 3 languages, and I have some knowledge of the old script, though not fluently. She paused. Why? Because what happens next will be significantly easier if you are literate, he said, as if this were obvious, which perhaps to him it was. He straightened. You will be given rooms in the East Wing. A maid will be assigned to you. Tomorrow you will begin instruction in court protocol. You will not speak to anyone about the vile bloodline until I have spoken to the council about how this will be managed. He looked at the servo one more time, and in that look there was something Seren would spend the following days trying to identify, something that lived at the intersection of respect and reluctance. Is there anything you need tonight? She thought about her small room in the lower palace, her books of herb lore, her mother's pendant that hung above the narrow bed, the dried bouquet of heather she kept in the window because it was the last thing her mother had given her. My things, she said, from my room, and my cat, if that is permissible. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same territory. It was brief and quickly gone, but she caught it, and it lodged in her chest like a splinter, small and insistent. Your cat, he said. She is old, and she does not like strangers. She will not eat if I am not there. He considered this with the gravity of a man weighing strategic alliances. I will have your belongings moved tonight, he said. The cat as well. He moved toward the door, and she had the impression that this was how he always moved, with purpose and efficiency, and no wasted motion, as if the distance between where he was and where he needed to be was always a problem to be solved, rather than a journey to be experienced. At the door, he paused without turning. Seren Ashvale, he said. What your mother told you about your blood. How much do you remember? She thought of fever-bright eyes and hands that gripped too tight, and words that had come in fragments between labored breaths. Enough to be frightened, she said honestly. He was quiet for a moment. Good, he said. Frightened people are careful. People survive. And then he left, and she was alone with the servo and the beeswax smell and the weight of a destiny she had spent her entire life not believing in. The East Wing was cold and large, and entirely unlike anything she had ever slept in. The bed was 4 times the size of her old one, hung with curtains of deep blue wool, and the fireplace was tall enough that she could have stood inside it without ducking. Her things arrived within the hour, carried by 2 young attendants who were very carefully not looking at the curvo, which had settled itself in the corner of the room with the regal ease of a creature that has slept in palaces before and found them acceptable. Her cat, Thistle, a gray-muzzled creature of extreme age and low tolerance, was brought in a wicker basket, and when released she immediately hissed at the servo, marched to the center of the bed, and sat down with the authority of a queen reclaiming her throne. The servo watched this with what looked, impossibly, like amusement. Seren lay awake for a long time, listening to the palace breathe around her. It breathed differently here than in the lower levels, slower and more certain, the breath of a place accustomed to importance. She thought about the vile bloodline. She thought about her mother's hands, rough from the dye work she had done all her life, the hands of a woman who had come down a very long way from wherever her blood began. She thought about the king's gray eyes, and the thing that had moved through them when he looked at the servo, the reluctance that was not quite reluctance, but something more complicated than a simple word could hold. And she thought about Lord Caston's unfinished sentence. There is the matter of Lady Mireille. She had seen Lady Mireille Voss twice, both times at a distance, both times in circumstances that made her own plainness feel particularly acute. Lady Mireille was the kind of beautiful that looked like it had been deliberately designed, golden-haired and graceful, and possessed of the kind of social fluency that allowed her to command a room while appearing to do nothing more than inhabit it. She was the daughter of the most powerful noble house after the crown, and she had been chosen by the royal council as the king's intended mate 3 months ago, a selection that was described in every corridor of the palace as inevitable, logical, and mutually advantageous. Lady Mireille moved through the palace with the quiet confidence of a woman who knows where she is going, and is not particularly interested in obstacles. Seren suspected that she herself was about to become one of those obstacles. She suspected this was not going to be comfortable. She was right. But she did not yet know how right she was, and so she eventually slept, with Thistle warm against her feet, and the servo luminous in the corner, and the festival continuing somewhere outside in the dark without her. Court protocol, as it turned out, was both more complex and more specifically designed to exclude people like her than she had imagined. Her instructor was a small, precise woman named Mistress Aldwin, who had been teaching noble daughters how to curtsy and manage their silverware for 30 years, and who regarded Seren with the expression of a gardener who has been handed a dandelion and asked to make it presentable for a flower show. The lessons began at dawn and ran until midday. How to walk in formal spaces, how to address the 12 T. Different ranks of nobility, how to eat without making noise, how to stand without shifting, how to smile without meaning it, which Seren privately thought might be the most useless skill she had ever been asked to develop, but which Mistress Aldwin assured her was essential for political survival. Between lessons, she had visits from Lord Caston with more documents, from council members who asked questions clearly designed to assess whether she was intelligent or malleable, or preferably both, and from a court physician who declared her constitution sound in a tone that made her feel appraised for purchase. And on the second morning, while she was attempting to learn the seating hierarchy of the 17 noble houses for the third time, a knock came at the door that was different from the others. Different in the sense that it was perfectly timed, 3 precise knocks, and different in the sense that the woman who entered without waiting for a response moved through doorways the way water moves, with perfect ease and zero acknowledgement that the space belonged to anyone else. Lady Mireille Voss wore a gown the color of winter sky and carried a small arrangement of flowers that were clearly from the palace's finest hothouse, and she smiled at Seren with every appearance of genuine warmth. "I wanted to come myself," she said, rather than send a note. It seemed more appropriate given the circumstances. Seren stood, because that was what Mistress Aldwin had told her to do. When a superior entered, and she was attempting to practice even when it felt absurd. "Lady Mireille," she said, "I am honored." "Please, sit," Lady Mireille said, and sat herself in the chair nearest the window, with the fluency of someone for whom every chair is the right chair. She set the flowers on the table between them. They were white roses, which Seren noted and decided not to think about too carefully. "I imagine this has all been rather overwhelming," Lady Mireille said with a sympathy that was perfectly pitched, warm enough to invite trust, and careful enough to reveal nothing. "Coming up from the lower palace so suddenly. Everything changing overnight." "It has been an adjustment," Seren said carefully. "Of course it has." Lady Mireille looked at the servo, which had not moved from its corner, and her expression was a masterwork of controlled reaction. She looked, and she registered, and she returned her gaze to Seren, with the smooth inevitability of someone who has practiced this exact emotional sequence. "It is a remarkable creature," she said. "The historians are beside themselves. Apparently the last record of its appearance was during the reign of Aldrich's great-grandfather, and even then it was only glimpsed. That it appeared so clearly, so publicly, and that it recognized you." She let the sentence soften into a kind of wondering silence. "The kingdom will be talking about nothing else." "I expect so," Seren said. Lady Mireille looked at her then, with a directness that was the first moment of genuine communication that had passed between them. The first moment where the social performance thinned enough to allow something real through. "I want you to know," she said, "that I bear you no ill will. What happened was not your doing. The old powers move as they will, and none of us have the right to resent the instruments they choose." Her voice was even and gracious and entirely impossible to argue with. "I simply wanted you to know that I intend to behave correctly in all of this. I hope you will extend me the same courtesy." It was beautifully done. Seren recognized it the way she recognized certain plants in the wild, by the particular quality of their edge. The white roses, the careful warmth, the explicit absence of threat, which was itself a kind of threat, because it established a debt of courtesy that Seren was now expected to honor, a debt that would be called in at some future time of Lady Murray's choosing. Of course, Seren said. I would not wish anything else. Lady Murray smiled, and it was a real smile this time, with a quality to it that was harder to read, something that might have been relief, or might have been satisfaction, or might have been the quiet pleasure of a chess player who has successfully placed their first piece. She rose and touched the flowers lightly with 2 fingers. I chose the white ones, she said. They seemed fitting under the circumstances. She left with the same seamless ease with which she had arrived, and the door closed. And Seren sat for a moment looking at the white roses, and thinking about all the things that had just been said, and the considerably larger number of things that had not been said. And then she went back to learning the seating hierarchy of the 17 noble houses. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. The formal presentation happened on the 3rd evening in the Great Hall of Vorn Palace, with its long table and hanging banners and collective assembled weight of expectation. Seren wore a dark green gown made in 2 days, silver at the collar, and her mother's pendant at her throat, which Mistress Aldwyn had raised an eyebrow at, and she had decided to wear anyway. She did not feel, looking at herself in the glass before leaving, like a portadora of founding blood. She felt like herself in an unfamiliar dress. She decided that would have to be sufficient. The Cervo walked beside her, through the corridors with its luminous presence and its unhurried certainty, and she was grateful for it, in the way she might be grateful for a very large, very calm companion on an uncertain walk. The king was already at the table when she entered, seated at its head with that quality of presence without performance that made him appear to take up more space than his physical form required. He watched her cross the room, and her awareness of that watching was a physical sensation. Like warmth from a fire you feel before you consciously register its source. Lady Murray sat 3 seats to the king's right, in deep gold, that turned the candlelight into something personal and exclusive, and she watched the evening with the patient attention of a woman who has assessed the terrain and found it, on balance, manageable. Lord Caston made a speech. Several council members made speeches. The formal language of the old compact was read aloud in the original tongue, which Seren followed imperfectly. When her name was spoken in the old tongue, Serenaya Vile Ashval, the name her bloodline carried before generations of descent had worn it smaller and less legible. Something moved through the room that was not quite sound and not quite light, but which the Cervo responded to, lifting its great head and releasing from its throat a sound like distant bells. And every person in the hall went entirely still. When it ended, the silence that followed had a different quality than the silence that had preceded it, as if the room had been tuned to a new key. Seren sat in the center of all of it and breathed. The king was looking at her when she found the composure to look up, and the expression on his face was not the analytical assessment of the first hours or the careful distance of the council chamber. It was something unguarded and momentary and quickly replaced, but she had caught it in the fraction of a second before the replacement, and she looked away at her hands. In her lap, ordinary hands, hands that knew herbs and bandages and mortar and pestle, hands that did not yet know what they were supposed to do with everything they had apparently inherited. The dinner that followed was an endurance exercise in social navigation. She spoke when spoken to, and listened carefully to everything said to her, learning that 3 council members considered the affair a useful political asset, 2 considered it an inconvenience, and 1, a hawk-faced old man named Lord Emery, considered it a direct sign from the old powers that the current political arrangements were about to be significantly disrupted. She found this last position the most honest, and therefore the most alarming. At the end of the evening, she walked back through the palace corridors feeling, for the first time since the courtyard, not smaller than the situation, but level with it. Not ready, exactly, but present. In the days that followed, she began to understand the shape of the life she had been moved into. It was larger than her previous life in every direction, and stranger in ways she had not anticipated. Not only the formal strangeness of protocol and rank, but the more intimate strangeness of visibility. She had spent her entire adult life moving through spaces unobserved, and now she was observed constantly. The council members watched her for political relevance. The noble daughters watched her with the sideways assessment of people calculating whether a new variable threatened or offered opportunity. And the king himself, when their paths crossed with a frequency she was not certain was accidental, watched her in the way she had noticed in the first hours, with that analytical attention that had begun to contain within it something else, something layered beneath the assessment that she could not quite name, but which she was increasingly certain he was aware of, and was, with considerable discipline, attempting not to act on. He found reasons to speak to her. She understood this slowly, the way you understand weather patterns, by accumulating observations until a shape emerges. He asked her questions specific to her rather than to her situation, not about the Vale bloodline or the compact, but about her work, her knowledge, the particular plants she preferred and why. He listened to her answers with the complete attention of someone for whom listening is not performance but genuine reception, and she found this harder to manage than almost. Anything else about him? Because she was not accustomed to being listened to, and it made her feel, disconcertingly, like something that mattered. "You have read Aldrin's compendium?" he said on one of these occasions, standing at the window of the council antechamber with the morning light making the storm gray of his eyes something closer to silver. "All 6 volumes?" "4," she said. "I have not been able to find the 5th and 6th. I believe they are in the restricted archive." "They are," he said. "I will have them sent to you. The 5th volume contains the original account of the Vale bloodline's awakening protocols. You should read it." He paused, a very small pause. "I read it last night." The implication of that settled somewhere in her chest and refused to leave. She said, "I am still adjusting to the idea that my blood is something that can be read about." "Your mother told you something about it," he said. "Fragments," she said. She made it sound like a responsibility. More than an inheritance. She said the Vale women did not rule. They served. They were the connective tissue between what the kingdom was and what it needed to become. She looked at the pendant against her chest without meaning to, and his gaze followed hers. "I thought she was being poetic." She often was when the fever was high. "When did she die?" he asked. The question was direct, but not careless. 6 years ago, she said. She was 39. She was glad I had the palace. Apprenticeship. She said this was the right place for me to be. She considered this. I suppose she knew something I did not. He held her gaze for a moment longer than the situation technically required, and she felt the awareness of him as a physical pressure, the way you feel the weight of weather before rain actually falls. Then he said, "The 5th volume will be with you by afternoon," and left, and she stood in the antechamber after he had gone, knowing with the quiet certainty of someone who has always trusted her instincts that she was not reading things into his silences that were not there. Lady Mireille noticed. Of course she did. Lady Mireille was the kind of person who noticed everything, who catalogued observations the way a natural historian catalogues specimens, with precision and patience and an eye for the significance of small variations. She said nothing directly. She was far too skilled for that. But she began to appear in the spaces where Seren appeared. Always. Graceful. Always socially appropriate. Always with some legitimate reason for her presence. And she began to speak to the king with a frequency and an ease that was a demonstration as much as a conversation, a reminder of the architecture of their existing connection, of the shared language of people who have known each other for years, and who understand each other's references. She was not cruel. She was something more sophisticated than cruel. She was a person re-establishing the natural order of things through the simple accumulated weight of her presence, and she did it so smoothly that if Seren had not been watching carefully, she would not have seen it at all. But Seren had been watching carefully all her life. It was her most practiced skill. She read the 5th volume that evening and most of the 6th, and what she found in them was both more and less than she had expected. More in the sense that the Vielle lineage was documented in extraordinary detail, its origins woven into the founding of the kingdom at a level that made clear it was not incidental but structural, a bloodline deliberately placed to serve as the kingdom's connection to the old powers, to the living world beneath the political world, to the forces that were neither lichen nor human, but something older than both. Less in the sense that the awakening itself was described in terms that were more practical than mystical. It was not a transformation or a revelation, but a deepening, a gradual process by which the dormant blood learned to recognize itself, to respond to what was around it, to extend its awareness into the old channels that the founding had originally opened. It would not happen all at once. It would not be comfortable. And it would, the 6th volume noted with the dry precision of a scholar who had clearly witnessed it and survived to write about it, be responsive to the specific conditions of its environment. Meaning, what was around her would shape what she became. She looked at Thistle, asleep in the chair across the room. She looked at the servo, luminous and patient in its corner. She looked at the pendant against her chest, at the small carved bone shape that her mother had worn every day of her adult life, and had pressed into her hands on a night when neither of them had wanted to speak about what was ending. She thought about what was around her. She thought about the king's gray eyes reading the 5th volume in the middle of the night. She thought about Lord Emery's son in the corridor, and Lady Murray's white roses, and Lord Caston's documents, and Mistress Aldwyn's measured disapproval, and the strange new vocabulary of a life she had not chosen, and was not certain she was equipped for. She thought about all of this, and then she set the books down and she went to the window, and she looked out at the kingdom in the dark, at its lights and its distances and its weight, and she thought, I did not ask for this. And then, for the first time, but I am, here. It was not acceptance exactly. It was something prior to acceptance, the thing that happens before you accept a thing, when you stop spending energy on the fact that it is there, and begin spending energy on what to do about it. It was small and unglamorous, and entirely unlike the awakening described in romantic terms by the scholars of the Old Compact. And it was, she thought, probably exactly right. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications. On. The shift happened gradually, and then all at once, the way most important things do. She began to feel it in small ways first, a heightened sensitivity to the palace's underground streams, a pull of water she could trace through 3 floors of stone with growing accuracy. Plants in the herb garden responded to her attention before she touched them. The Curvo moved with a new purposefulness beside her, its amber eyes carrying something more specific than before, something that felt like directed communication. She told the king, because she trusted him in a way she had examined carefully from multiple angles and continued to find sound, because he had not once in the week since the courtyard attempted to use her situation for his own advantage, had not performed interest in her for political purposes. He had been honest with her when honesty was less convenient than management, and in her experience that was rare enough to matter. She told him in the council antechamber again, because it was where they most often found themselves in the same space with a legitimate reason to speak privately, and he listened with the complete attention that she was finding both essential and difficult. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment, the productive quiet she had learned to recognize, the quiet of actual consideration, rather than polite pause. The water sensitivity is consistent with what the 6th volume describes, he said. The founders built the original palace. Infrastructure with the old channels in mind. The East Wing in particular was designed around a specific underground source. He looked at her. You felt it through the floor. Through 3 floors of stone, she confirmed. And the plants in the lower garden have been responding to me since the 2nd week. Petra noticed and thought I had been using a particular fertilizer blend. He almost smiled. The almost smile was becoming something she looked for, a small private event that she tracked. The way she tracked weather. What does it feel like? He asked. She considered how to be accurate. Like hearing a sound you have always been able to hear, but never identified as sound before, she said. As if it was always there, and I was simply describing it as something else, background sensation, normal noise. And now I am beginning to hear it clearly, and it is not noise at all. It is... She paused. It is something listening back. The old compact describes it as a relationship, he said. Not a power in the singular sense, a responsiveness. The vile line was never meant to command the old forces, only to mediate between them and the kingdom, to be permeable, to allow communication in both directions. He paused. It is not a comfortable position. No, she agreed. You are managing it well, he said, and she felt it the way she felt the underground water, as a pull rather than a pressure. My father did not believe in the old compact. He called it political mythology and governed without reference to the old powers for 20 years. And the kingdom's foundations deteriorated in ways engineers have been attempting to address ever since. I have governed the same way for 7 years. Something moved through his face. That was the closest thing to vulnerability she had seen from him. The servo appearing publicly, in front of 500 witnesses, is a message about the cost of that. Seren understood, with the sudden completeness of a thing clicking into place, why he had been reading the 5th volume in the middle of the night. It was about his kingdom, and what he had been failing to tend in it. You are looking at it now, she said. He met her eyes, and what she saw there was entirely unguarded, a kind of relief that had been waiting a long time for somewhere to land. Yes, he said. I am looking at it now. Lady Mireille made her move on a Thursday, because Lady Mireille was the kind of person who chose her timing the way a general chooses terrain, with patience and precision, and a full understanding of the advantages available to her. She made it at the weekly council dinner, in front of 30 witnesses, which was not accidental, because everything Lady Mireille did in public was the opposite of accidental, and she made it so gracefully that Seren's first response was not indignation, but something close to admiration. I have been thinking, Lady Mireille said, during a pause in the formal conversation that she had clearly been gently engineering for several minutes, about the question of the Portadora's formal integration into court life. She addressed herself primarily to Lord Caston, which was exactly right, because Lord Caston was the person most invested in the formal answer, and the king was the person she was actually speaking to. It seems to me that the current arrangement, while necessary in the immediate term, creates a certain ambiguity about status that could be resolved more elegantly. She paused, and the pause was a small masterwork of timing. In the old tradition, the Portadora was attached formally to the ruling house, not as a servant, of course, but as a recognized auxiliary position. The term was, I believe, keeper of the compact. She smiled at Seren across the table, warm and clear and entirely controlled. It would formalize your position and remove any uncertainty about your role in court. It was brilliant. Seren understood it completely within 3 seconds of hearing it and spent the following 30 deciding how much of what she understood she was going to show. The keeper of the compact was an auxiliary position, meaning separate from the line of power. Formal, meaning fixed. Recognized, meaning not able to be elevated further without contradiction of the formal record. It would give her title and visibility, and absolutely no path forward that was not already mapped and bounded. It would solve the council's discomfort about her ambiguous status, and it would, simultaneously, draw a line under the question of what she could become. It was, in the vocabulary of chess, a capturing move dressed as a gifting move, and it had been made in front of 30 witnesses, which meant any refusal would require a public justification she did not currently have the standing to offer. She looked at the king. He was looking at Lady Mireille with an expression that was unreadable, which in his case meant he was reading everything, processing at the speed of a mind that had been trained on political architecture since childhood. His thumb moved once against the stem of his wineglass, a small, unconscious motion she had not seen from him before, and she filed it away in the keeping room. "That is an interesting proposal," Lord Caston said, in the tone of a man who finds a proposal interesting primarily because it solves a problem he has been quietly having. "The historical precedent is clear. I would need to research the specific protocols, but the principle is sound." The king said, "The principle is premature." Everyone looked at him. Lady Mireille's smile did not waver, but something behind it adjusted, a microscopic recalibration. "Your Majesty," she said. "The awakening is ongoing," he said. He was looking at his wineglass now, not at Lady Mireille or Seren or the council, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone stating an engineering fact. "Formalizing a title for a process that has not concluded is poor administrative practice. We will revisit the question when the servo's recognition has fully manifested." He looked up then, and he looked at Seren, and the look was specific and brief, and communicated something she received clearly, without being able to say precisely what it was. Then he looked at Lady Mireille with the courteous distance of their established relationship. "The thought is well-intentioned," he said. "We will return to it." Lady Mireille inclined her head. "Of course," she said, and returned to the formal conversation as if the exchange had not occurred, which was perhaps the most impressive thing she had done all evening. Serene looked at her water-glass and thought about the word premature, and what it implied about timing, and what it implied about futures that were not yet foreclosed, and what it implied about a man who had read the 5th volume of Aldrin's Compendium at midnight when he could have been sleeping, and she thought that the keeping room in her interior was becoming a very full place. The awakening accelerated after that, in a way that the 6th volume had suggested it might, as if the formal acknowledgement in the council dinner had done something structural to the internal architecture of her blood. The water sensitivity deepened into something she could actively direct, find specific sources, trace specific paths, feel the health or distress of the palace's underground channels with growing accuracy. She could feel the servo's attention as a distinct presence at the edge of her awareness, like a second heartbeat, patient and consistent. And she began to dream in a way she had not dreamed before, not narratives but sensations, the feeling of deep root systems and long memory, and something vast and slow that was not quite consciousness, but was also not its absence, something that existed at the boundary of what she could hold in a human mind, and that left her, upon waking, with the residue of a perspective so wide it made her own life feel simultaneously smaller and more significant. Lord Emery requested a private meeting 3 days later. He came to her rooms in the late afternoon, when the light was low and gold, and the servo was particularly luminous in it, and he sat across from her with the hawk face of a man who has operated at the edges of political power for 50 years and has learned to value directness for its efficiency. "I will not waste your time with preamble," he said. "You are more prepared than I initially assessed, and I respect that. I also find I have concerns about how the current situation is being managed." "The current situation," she said. "Lady Mireille Vos is a formidable political actor," he said. "Her family's alliance with the Vorn house predates the king's rule by 2 generations. The council's selection of her as the king's intended was not incidental. It was the resolution of a 20-year negotiation. Disrupting that arrangement carries consequences that go beyond personal preference." He looked at the servo. What the old compact requires and what the political structure of the kingdom can currently accommodate are not always identical. You are telling me to be careful, she said. I am telling you, he said, that the keeper of the compact position Lady Mireille proposed would solve a genuine problem, and that refusing to solve genuine problems because of personal considerations is not wisdom, it is sentiment. He paused. The king's judgment is excellent in most areas. In the area of the Portadora, I am less certain of his objectivity. He looked at her directly. I am not certain of yours either. She held his gaze. What would it take, she asked, for you to be certain of mine? He considered her for a long moment, the hawk eyes measuring. Then, evidence that you understand the difference between what the kingdom needs and what you want, he said. Those are not always the same thing. The Vielle women understood this. That is what made them valuable. He rose. The blood moon ceremony is in 6 weeks. The council will expect a formal announcement about the Portadora's status at or before it. I would encourage you to consider your position carefully before then. He left. The Cervo watched him go. Seren sat for a long time afterward in the low gold light, thinking about the difference between what the kingdom needs and what you want, and turning the question over the way she turned difficult herbs, looking for the thorns, finding them, and not letting herself pretend they were not there. She went to the king that evening, to the council chamber where she knew he would be working late, because there was something she needed to say, and because waiting for the right occasion was a luxury she was not certain she had. He looked up from his documents, and his expression shifted from concentration to something more alert and less controlled. Seren, he said, and the use of her name alone was something she noted without allowing herself to linger on. It. She told him what Lord Emery had said, accurately and completely, because she had decided that accuracy was the only kind of loyalty worth offering to someone whose own primary currency was honesty. He listened without interrupting. When she had finished, he said, "What do you think?" "I think he is right that the two things are not always identical," she said. "And I think he is also using a true thing to accomplish a specific outcome, and that the true thing and the specific outcome are not the same." "No," he agreed. "The keeper of the compact position would remove me from consideration," she said, because if she was going to say it, she was going to say it plainly. "As anything other than a formal auxiliary. I am not saying that is wrong. I am saying I want to understand clearly what the stakes are before I agree to or refuse anything." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have been thinking about what you said, that I am looking at the kingdom now, in the way I was not before. The truthful version of that is more complicated. I am looking at the kingdom, and I am also looking at other things, and I have been attempting to determine whether those two activities are in conflict." He paused. "Lord Emery would say they are." "Are they?" she asked. The candlelight made his gray eyes something warmer than their usual storm, and she was aware of him in the way she was aware of the underground water, as a pull through solid matter. "I do not know yet," he said. "I intend to find out before the blood moon ceremony." She nodded and turned to leave, and he said her name again, just that, and she turned back. "What your mother told you about the Vielle women," he said. She was right, but she was describing only part of it. The 6th volume, the account of the last Portadora. He stopped, and she waited. "She was not only the kingdom's connective tissue," he said finally. "She was the king's. The old compact describes it as a dual function, political and personal. Inseparable." He looked at her directly. "I thought you should know that." She stood for a moment in the full weight of this. Then she said, "Yes, I know." And she left, walking back through the palace corridor with the Turvo at her side, and the sense that the keeping room was now so full it was beginning to press outward into the rest of her. The next 2 weeks were the kind of time that does not feel like time, while it is happening, but becomes, in retrospect, the period when everything essential was decided. Seren continued her lessons and her walks and her reading, and the awakening continued its deepening, her awareness of the palace's living systems growing more precise, her dreams shifting from sensation to something more structured, images from the old founding period that she was beginning to cross-reference with the historical documents Lord Caston brought her. She began to understand what the compact actually was, not a political document, but a living agreement, a relationship between the kingdom's Lycan power and the older power that the land itself carried, brokered through the Vale bloodline for reasons the founders had understood and subsequent rulers had slowly forgotten. She went to the restricted archive herself and spent a long afternoon with documents that had not been opened in 40 years, and she found what she was looking for in the original founding records, the specific language of the compact's intent, the relationship it described between Portadora and King not as hierarchy but as function, two elements of a single mechanism that required each other to operate as designed. The Portadora and the ruling king were not separate concerns. They never had been. The question was only whether the people involved were willing to recognize what the land had recognized in the courtyard, and what the Cuervo had been declaring ever since. She sent the king a note. "I have been to the founding archive. There is something you should read." She did. Not sign it, because he would know. He came within the hour. She showed him the documents, the original compact language, the founding records, the specific passage that described the function of the Portadora not as auxiliary to the ruling house, but as integral to it, a structural requirement of the compact's operation, the connective tissue her mother had described made explicit in formal historical language, not metaphor, but architectural fact. He read in silence, his dark head bent over the documents, and when he finished, he looked at her with the expression she had seen before, but wider now, the door entirely open, and what was on the other side of it was exactly what she had seen in the neighborhood, of something real and large, and not yet named. And it was named now. "The council will say it is a historical curiosity," he said, "that the compact's original intent does not bind current governance. Lord Emery will say the political complications are too significant," she said. "And he will be partially right. Lady Mireille's family will withdraw their support if the alliance is ended," he said. "That is not a small thing." "No," she agreed. "It is not." He looked at her steadily. "None of that is the question I am actually trying to answer," he said. "I know," she said. The silence between them then was different from all the previous silences. This was the silence of a thing that had been said completely, without words, and that was now simply occupying its full space in the room. He crossed the distance between them, 3 steps, and put his hand against the side of her face with the careful precision of someone handling something valued, and she felt the warmth of it through the whole of the keeping room, through every catalogued observation and filed moment. And the servo lifted its great head and made a sound that was not bells, but something lower and older, resonating in the stone of the walls, and the water beneath the floors, and the deep channels of the compact running through everything like veins. "The blood moon ceremony," he said. His thumb moved against her cheekbone. "I intend to make an announcement. The council will be very unhappy," she said. "Yes," he said, with the tone of a man who has made his peace with that. "They will." "Aldrich," she said. It was the first time she had used his name, and they both registered it, a small, exact threshold. "The compact requires both of us to understand what we are agreeing to." "Understand it," he said. "Do you?" She thought of her mother's hands, and the pendant against her chest, and the underground water, and the Cuervo, booing in the courtyard, on the day everything changed, and she thought, "Yes. I have understood it for weeks. I was simply waiting to be certain I was not understanding it alone." "Yes," she said. "I understand it." He kissed her then, simply and without performance, with the full weight of a decision already made, and she kissed him back with the accumulated honesty of the keeping room finally released, and the servo's sound continued in the walls and the floors and the old channels of the compact's foundation, steady and certain and entirely without surprise. The blood moon ceremony arrived on a night so clear it seemed the sky had been deliberately arranged, the moon huge and amber red at the horizon and climbing. The palace's great courtyard filled with the same 500 who had witnessed the servo's recognition 6 weeks before. And several hundred more. They stood in their ranks, the council in their formal robes, the noble houses in their colors, Lady Mireille Voss in silver white, with the practiced composure of a woman who has had 6 weeks to prepare herself for something she did not entirely want and has decided to face with dignity. Seren stood at the ceremony's appointed place with the servo at her right side and the pendant warm at her throat, wearing deep blue, the color of the sky at the precise hour between darkness and dawn. Her hair was loose, because her mother had worn her hair loose, and because some things you do not negotiate. She felt the underground water beneath her feet, the servo's awareness at the edge of her own, the old compact's channels running through the stone and the earth, and the particular quality of the blood moon's light, which was not ordinary light, but something ceremonially significant, a frequency that opened dormant things and completed ongoing processes, and said to the eye, "Blood. Now." Lord Caston delivered the formal reading of the compact, with the gravity of a man who is aware that tonight's event is going to significantly complicate his administrative life. The ceremonial language rose and fell, and the crowd was very still, and the moon climbed, and the amber red deepened to the color of old fire, the color of something that has been waiting a long time to be seen. And then the king stepped forward. He was not in his ceremonial coat tonight. He wore the formal attire of the old compact's ritual, which was simpler and older, dark wool and silver, the founding-era design that had not been worn by a Vorn king at ceremony in 100 years, because the Vorn kings had not, in 100 years, been standing at a blood moon ceremony with a portadora beside them. He stood at his designated position, and he looked at the assembled court, and he spoke clearly and without preamble, because he did not do preamble. The blood moon ceremony requires the formal completion of what was begun 6 weeks ago in this courtyard, he said. The servo's recognition of a portadora of founding blood is not a beginning in itself. It is a precondition. The compact's structure requires that recognition to be met by a corresponding recognition from the ruling house. The founding records are specific on this point, as I discovered upon reading them recently for the first time, which I will acknowledge as a failure of my education and of my governance, and which I intend to spend a significant amount of time correcting. He paused. There was no sound in the courtyard except the torches and the distant night. The portadora is not an auxiliary position. The keeper of the compact is not a title that separates this function from the governing structure. The compact's founders understood the portadora's role as integral, structural, and specific. Specific to this house, specific to this line. He looked at Seren, and the look was the open door, fully open, in front of 500 witnesses, which was itself a kind of declaration prior to the one he was about to make. I am formally requesting that Seren Vile Ashval be recognized not as auxiliary to the Vorn line but as its compact bound, the term the founders used, the function they designed, the relationship the kingdom's foundation requires, and that I am, as of this ceremony, prepared to honor in the full extent the compact describes. The silence lasted for a long time. Lord Caston looked at his documents. Lord Emery looked at the king with the expression of a man revising a calculation in real time. The noble houses shifted and murmured and processed. Lady Mireille Voss stood very still in her silver white, and when the murmuring had settled enough that her voice would carry, she said, clearly, and with the grace that was her most consistent quality, "The Voss house acknowledges the compact's requirement and extends its support to its proper fulfillment. It was exactly right. It was the move that preserved what could be preserved and released gracefully what could not be kept, and Seren recognized it for what it was. The act of a woman who had decided that her own dignity was worth more than the fight, and who was not wrong. She inclined her head toward Lady Mireille, across the distance of the courtyard, a gesture of genuine respect, and Lady Mireille returned it with something in her expression that was not warmth exactly, but was the beginning of a thing that might, in time, become something like regard between equals who have found themselves on different sides of the same complicated situation. The turbot moved. It had been still throughout the ceremony, patient and luminous in the blood moonlight, and now it moved from Seren's side to the center of the ceremonial space, and it stood between her and the king, and it raised its great antlered head, and the sound it made was the bell sound from the presentation ceremony, and also the deep stone sound from the antechamber, and also something else, something she had not heard before, something that was both of those things and older than both of them, a sound that was the compact itself made audible, the living agreement that ran through the kingdom's foundation given voice by the instrument of its expression, and every person in the courtyard felt it in their blood and their bones, and the deep animal substrate beneath the social performance of civilization felt it as recognition, as rightness, as the particular satisfaction of something long incomplete finding its completion. And in the feeling of it, in the resonance of the old sound moving through stone and earth and blood, Seren felt something open in her that she had not known was closed. Not power exactly, not the dramatic awakening of the historical accounts, but something more fundamental, the full arrival of herself into the life she had been born for, the complete occupancy of the shape that had always been hers and that she had spent 24 years living beside without entering. It was not a transformation, it was a recognition. She recognized herself, finally, completely, in the way the Cervo had recognized her in the courtyard 6 weeks ago. And the recognition traveled outward through the old channels of the compact, and through the underground water, and through the early flowering garden, and through everything that had been responding to her since the awakening began. And the response that came back was immediate and vast and entirely certain. Yes. Yes. This is the one. This is right. This is the connective tissue restored. This is the relationship fulfilled. Yes. She breathed. She looked at the king across the distance of the ceremonial space, at Aldrich Vorn, who had read the 5th volume at midnight, and refused the premature title, and opened the door and crossed the 3 steps and said, "I understand it," and who was looking at her now with the storm-gray eyes fully present. No assessment, no management, no distance, only the complete and particular attention of a man who has stopped withholding something he has been holding for a very long time. She crossed the space between them, because the compact described this, because the ceremony required it, because she wanted to, all 3 of those things simultaneously and inseparably. And when she reached him, he took her hand with the same careful precision he had used in the antechamber, the handling of something valued, and the servos. Sound continued around them and above them, and the blood moon's amber-red light made everything its own particular color of ancient fire. "The compact is fulfilled," Lord Caston said, in the voice of a man reading from a document that has surprised him, and who is choosing to accept the surprise professionally. "The Portadora is recognized. The compact bound is established. The blood moon ceremony is complete." The courtyard erupted in sound, all 500 voices and the torches and the night. And the servos sustained resonance, and in the center of all of it, Seren Vial Ashvel stood with her hand in the king's hand and felt the underground water beneath her feet, and the old channels running through everything, and the pendant warm at her throat, and the faint distant presence of her mother's voice. Not the fever words, but the earlier words. The everyday words from when she had been well, and the 2 of them had sat together in a small house at the edge of Marin's Cross, and her mother had said, "You are more than you think you are. You are more than they will tell you. Wait and be patient. and do not run when the white one comes. She had been 32 years old when she said it, still young, her hands still smooth, her eyes still their ordinary brown rather than the fever bright of the ending, and Seren had been 8 and had thought her mother was telling her a story. She had been telling her the truth. She had been telling her everything, all of it, the whole shape of the life that was waiting, patient as the cervo, luminous in the dark, bowing when the time came and not before. Seren pressed the pendant between her fingers and looked up at the blood moon and thought, I know. I am here. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming? The weeks that followed the blood moon ceremony were, in the administrative sense, extraordinarily complicated and, in every other sense, the first period of Seren's life in which she felt fully located in her own existence. Lord Emery's revision of his calculations had produced a cautious but genuine support, and the Voss family made a formal statement within a week that was more than Seren had expected, and that she respected accordingly. Lady Mireille came to see her privately once, on a morning when winter was beginning to soften at its edges, and she sat across from Seren and said, with the directness of a woman who has made her calculation and is at peace with it, I want you to understand that I am not your enemy. I know, Seren said. I was protecting a position I had earned, Lady Mireille said. I do not apologize for that. I would not ask you to, Seren said. You were protecting what was yours. You did it gracefully. Lady Mireille looked at her for a moment, and something shifted in the assessing attention, some of the performance thinning, and what was beneath it was a person of genuine intelligence, who had simply been operating in a context that required her to be primarily strategic. When she left, it was with a nod between them that was not warmth exactly, but was the beginning of a thing that might grow, slowly and carefully, into respect. Aldrich, as she had begun to call him in private, was precise and honest and fully attentive, and constitutionally disinclined to waste words on things that did not require them. He was also, in the private spaces of the East Wing and the restricted archive, where they spent an increasing amount of time working through the founding records together. The person whose almost smile she had been cataloging since the first week, and who now sometimes allowed it to become a full smile, rare and briefly transformative. The face of someone who has been serious for a very long time, and has discovered that it is not, after all, the only way to be. He was careful with her in the way of someone who understands the value of what they are holding, and she was careful with him in the same way, and the carefulness between them was not distance, but its opposite. She wrote to the village of Marin's Cross, to the woman who had known her mother, and received a long letter that she read 3 times in the East Wing window with the spring light coming through and Thistle warm in her lap. The letter described Lysa Ashvale as a young woman who had carried something old in her blood quietly, and with humor and without complaint, who had never told Seren more than she was ready to hear, saving the most important things for the fever nights, because she understood that the distance between telling someone a truth and their being ready to hold it is not always bridgeable in ordinary time. She had been, the letter said, extraordinarily proud of her daughter. She had said she expected great things, not because of the blood, but because of the person, and she had distinguished carefully between those 2 sources, because she thought it mattered which one you relied on. Seren folded the letter and held it against the pendant for a long time. She thought, I know, Mama. I know. I am here. I am exactly here. In the late spring, when the ceremony of formal joining was held in the same great courtyard where everything had begun, with the servo present and the noble houses in their full formal arrays, and the sun bright rather than the blood moon's amber red, Seren wore the blue of the sky between darkness and dawn, and she wore her hair loose, and she wore the pendant at her throat, and she stood beside Aldrich Vorn in front of all of them without performing anything, without managing anything, without fear, not because there was nothing to be afraid of, but because she had stopped spending her energy on what she was afraid of and was spending it instead on what she was present for, which was the truest definition of courage she had ever found. The formal words were said. The compact's language was spoken. The chervo made. Its sound, the full resonance of it, the bells and the stone and the old deep note beneath both of them, and it moved through the courtyard and through the earth and through the channels of the compact's foundation. And the response from the kingdom was immediate and complete, the living agreement renewed, the connective tissue restored, the relationship the founders had understood, and 7 generations of kings had forgotten, finally, at last, remembered. She looked at Aldrich. He looked at her. He was almost smiling, and then he was actually smiling. The full transformation of it, the face of a serious man who has found, against considerable prior expectation, something worth the risk of joy. The courtyard was full of noise and the chervo's resonance and the spring light, and somewhere in the east wing Thistle was probably asleep in the good chair, and somewhere beneath her feet the underground water was running clean through its ancient channels, and her mother's pendant was warm at her throat, and she was home. Not in the way that is a place, but in the way that is a condition, a state of being fully in the right life rather than beside it. She took Aldrich's hand. He took hers. The compact was complete. The kingdom was beginning. And in the corner of the east wing, the servo's gentle light continued to burn, patient and certain and entirely, permanently home.